Very good morning to all of you. It is my privilege to welcome our Vice Chancellor, Dr. Father Antonia Vuveri, who will also be chairing this inaugural public lecture. And on behalf of our Vice Chancellor, Registrar, Deputy Registrars, my faculty colleagues, and of course on behalf of my students and all our well-wishers, we would like to welcome Honorable Sri Sujit Kumar, who has very kindly agreed to address all of us on this very, very historic occasion when we are launching the master's program in public policy and governance. Sir, as you know, it has been a long journey for the past 4 years. We have been working for this day, and I must honestly confess that it is only after our Vice Chancellor, Father Anthony Vuveri, took over in the month of November. We were all asked to pull up our socks and make sure we are able to see this day. And therefore, I would like to extend heartfelt gratitude to our Vice Chancellor and Father Registrar, Father Augustine, and all the other Deputy Registrar, Father Tony, and Father Arakyaraj, and all my fellow deans who are here, and also all my other colleagues of the university from both the campuses. Then, of course, our students have been eagerly waiting for your talk. So we welcome you once again for sparing your time. I know you have been very busy in this pandemic situation, yet you could take time off from your busy schedule and be with us. With these few words, I would like to request our Vice Chancellor, Father Anthony Vuveri, to give the chairman's address. Over to you, Father.
Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Xavier University, I welcome each and every one of you for this launch of this School of Public Policy and Governance. Especially, I welcome today's guest speaker, Honorable Rajya Sabha MP, Sri Sujit Kumar. I had an opportunity to interact with him. In the first sight, I fell in love with him. First, when I met him, I fell in love with him for two reasons. The clarity, understanding, and the way there is a profile, if you see his profile, purely is an academician. Second, I place him as a politician. First, he is an academician. And he has done his master's, and he has also done his public administration, public policy and governance from Harvard, and master's from Oxford. So all this profile matters a lot. And today, he is also a Rajya Sabha MP, and he has been with the government, working and helping the government even before becoming the Rajya Sabha MP in many ways. And he is also a professional in law. He has got his own law firm in Bhubaneswar, which serves as a consultant to many, many organizations and corporates. And we'll be very happy to hear from him. And in my opinion, when we talk about public policy, it is a very, very important subject. In our country, this particular subject or discipline is not much spoken. If you go to European countries or America, public policy is one of the very, very important program and course where most of the public leaders, the decision makers study. Even the corporate leaders, they go through this program, 2 years public policy and administration. Why public policy? And why governance? And what is government? Public policy, governance, and government. Earlier, people perceived government and governance are one and the same. Actually, government, yes, the legislators make the rules, get it approved, and they implement meticulously. When it comes to governance, you can govern an organization, you can govern a city, you can govern a society, you can govern a group, a community. Governance is much broader term, governance, where it is a transparent, where it is equitable, where it is a participative and collective, where it is a sustainable development. That will be the focus of governance. So therefore, my dear friend, it is more when we talk about the public policy, when it comes to public policy and governance, it is not only top-down approach, it is bottom-up approach. It's this and all top-down approach, bottom-up approach is a typical management terms, but when you talk about the public policy and governance, this is what it is. When it's a top-down approach and bottom-up approach, we need to merge these two. We need to strike a balance between these two. That is a good governance. There are governance theories, concepts, practices. We can go on and on and on. But when it comes to public policy, is for whom? For the public. For what? Policy is for what? For betterment of the society, better governance of the society, better implementation of the society, all the programs for the society. So therefore, it is a very, very important subject. I am very happy many of us have joined this launching this program. And to be very frank, this program officially, this school was launched in university on 5th of February 2020 by Honorable Chief Minister Naveen Patnaik of Orissa. So therefore, my dear friends, deans, colleagues, and faculty, students, today we are pleased to have Honorable Rajya Sabha MP Sujit Kumar with us, and I am sure he will share his thoughts and ideas with us so that we get motivated in this first day of our launch of this program. I once again, on behalf of the university, welcome all of you, particularly the Honorable Rajya Sabha MP Sujit Kumar and all other deans and faculty and all of you. So have very fruitful and purposeful and meaningful discussion this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Father, for giving us a nice background to the lecture and also introducing the speaker. However, I would like to say a few more words about our speaker of the occasion. So I shall take a minute to read about his profile from the text that I have, which has been sent to us from his office. Sri Sujit Kumar is serving the nation and his state of Odisha as a parliamentarian, that is member of Rajya Sabha Upper House. He earlier served as the advisor in the rank of Chief Secretary to the Special Development Council of Government of Odisha and as the Special Secretary of Odisha State Planning Board, very senior policy planning positions with Government of India, Government of Odisha. He is a trained engineer, lawyer, and a policy maker. He studied for the mid-career Masters in Public Administration at the prestigious Harvard Kennedy School, that is Harvard University. He also has an MBA degree from SET Business School, that is at University of Oxford, having the distinction of receiving the inaugural Skoll Scholarship for Social Entrepreneurship. He also holds 2 bachelor's degree from India, Bachelor of Engineering and Bachelor of Law. A trained arbitrator, Sri Sujit Kumar is also the founder, mentor at Lex Mandra LLP, a boutique law firm focused on advisory services for startups, domestic and overseas corporations, multinational companies, and multilateral bodies. He is also an adjunct faculty at Sri Sri University and advisor at Sri Sri Advanced Global Center for Indigenous Studies. Previously, he worked at the World Economic Forum, that is WEF, in Geneva, Switzerland, and for United Nations Development Program, that is UNDP, and for Infosys Technologies Limited in India. There are many more to talk about Sujit Kumar. Since we are running short of time, so with these few words of introduction, now I request Sri Sujit Kumar to deliver the inaugural public lecture. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Pepin. Thank you, Father Anthony, for those very, very kind words. Love at first sight. These are very strong compliments. Yeah. So, as Professor Pepin was mentioning, it's indeed a historic day for the university. At the outset, let me compliment the university, the Vice Chancellor, Father Anthony, the Professor, the Dean, Professor Pepin, all the faculty members, staff members, and most importantly, the students of the new program that is getting launched today. It's indeed a very historic occasion, and my profuse compliments to each and every one of you. Let me thank you all for inviting me, for making me part of this historic occasion, the launch event of MPPG, which is, I think, the flagship program of the School of Governance and Public Affairs, SGPA. This I take as a commencement address or a keynote address, as we say in the West. Whenever a new program is launched, they do invite someone from industry or from academia or from government to deliver the keynote or the commencement address. So I take this as the keynote or the commencement address. And let me make a quick disclosure. I do have an XUB connection. In fact, I think Professor Pepin did not mention that I've been inducted as an adjunct faculty at the School of Law of XUB.
We didn't know that. Sorry.
So, okay. so there lies the connection.
Okay.
So coming back to the launch event today, let me quote Victor Hugo, the French poet, dramatist, and playwright, who had said, "Nothing can stop an idea whose time has come." You know, the words may not exactly be the same because there are different versions of this idea, but basically, you know, I think today's event or the SGPA is indeed an idea whose time has come. You know, SGPA has been launched with a vision of creating public leaders, as Father Anthony was enumerating what is policy and what is public policy. And I will try to delve a bit more into it in the course of the next 30 minutes or so. But I have always been intrigued as to why Xavier, which is such a formidable brand in higher education in India, thought so late of starting a school of public policy. Indeed, when I relocated back to India in 2011, I was wondering if Xavier, I think it was not yet an university in those days. It was still called XIMB. So I was intrigued, and I was keen and curious to know if XIMB would be interested to start a school of public policy or public affairs or good governance, or the name nomenclature could be. And if I could help in any way building a relationship with the Kennedy School at Harvard or with the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford. I'm so glad, as they say, better late than never. Finally, SGPA has seen the light of the day, and as the Vice Chancellor was mentioning, it got inaugurated in February 2020, February of this year, by none less than the Honorable Chief Minister of the state, who himself, in my view, is amongst the foremost policy makers of this country today. And I have no doubt that the SGPA program, the SGPA Center and the MPPG program will carve a niche in the policy landscape of the country. Personally, I am a huge votary of public policy education. Father was mentioning about the importance of public policy in European countries in the West, especially US and continental Europe. Unfortunately, it was not given the same importance in our country. It's a fairly nascent field in India, and despite being a robust democracy for over 70 years now, we still didn't feel the need to have good schools of public policy or or good programs in public policy, creating thought leaders in public policy. In the let me give an example of the US.
Sir, your audio is off.
We'll come back.
Yeah.
I think he will come back. Some network problem.
Yeah.
He will connect now. Yeah. Meanwhile, let me engage all of you.
Yes,
till he comes back.
Yeah.
See, we also, in my address, I was talking about the same thing, about what is the importance of this course? Why this public policy? Why this public policy for us? Okay. In my experience, what I hear and I have seen and heard the last 1 year, most of the bureaucrats, IAS officers in India, are being sent to Harvard to do this public policy program. Public, the course that the Sujit sir has done, most of the IAS officers are sent there. Why? Why? Let's ask that question. Let's ask that question. Why most of the bureaucrats and IAS officers are sent there to study this particular program? It is mainly for a better governance. Governance, as I said, for what? For whom? It's one is for government. And another thing, efficient and effective functioning of the policies, implementing the policies, right? Now in India, if you see, MBBS means it's a hot cake. Or MBA in a leading business schools is a hot cake. Most of the cream of the country in our country, most of the cream of the country means the students. It will soft for either medical or MBA programs. But just opposite other side, in Harvard, most of the people who look for public policy in US or in Europe. You see, we have tie-up with Georgetown University. I have already connected Professor Pepin with Georgetown University. Georgetown University in Washington is our own Jesuit university. Okay, they are also running this the public policy program, and most of the politicians in US have gone through this program and studied in Washington, DC, in Jesuit University. Most of the politicians. Okay, so it is to have the better governance, but create leaders for tomorrow. That is what we need to take it up. Public policy, we have started with a small number. Yeah, Sarah has come back.
Has come back.
We have started with a small number. Definitely, I'm sure you will benefit from this program. And now Sarah has come, over to him. Yes, sir. Sailendra, Sarah,
Yeah, my apologies for the technical glitch. So I was talking about the importance of public policy and how personally I'm a huge votary of public policy education in India, and I was giving the example of the US where they have a bipartisan. Hello.
Yeah, yes, sir. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so the US has a presidential form of government, and whenever either of the two parties, either the Democrats or the Republicans, are in government, the secretaries, who we call ministers in India, almost all of them go to the schools of public policy at Harvard or at Maxwell Syracuse or at Duke. So that's the importance of public policy, the interdisciplinary nature of public policy in the US, which I think has the best public policy programs in the world. Uh, uh, I had the good fortune, and that's the case with every batch, every cohort. I had the good fortune of, taking classes with Professor Nick Burns, who was the architect of the Indo-US nuclear deal. Professor Kennist, who was, the Assistant Secretary of Finance. Even Secretary Condi Rice used to come and take guest lectures. So on and so forth. So that is the interaction, and that is the integration of academia and governance in the US. And I hope that things in India also will come to a stage where our ministers, our secretaries, and our bureaucrats, civil servants come to schools of public policy such as the SGPA, and students of SGPA in turn are able to go to the government for a stint, whether it's short stint or long stint, and are able to contribute to public policy making. Now, as I've said, public policy is a very, very interdisciplinary subject. Borrowing from as diverse fields as law, political science, history, economics, international relations, psychology, uh, even medicine. Just to name a few. Uh, you may look at the new education policy which was announced a couple of weeks ago. And to my mind,
Sir, can I just interrupt? There are some disturbances. Please, others who are keeping your audio on, kindly mute yourself. Those of you who have not muted your audio, please do so immediately. Yes, sir. Please go ahead. Anil in the control room, please do that. Mute your, sir, please. Sorry. Yeah.
So the new education policy, which was announced by the Ministry of Education, which was formerly known as the Ministry of HRD, is to my mind a very, very sound output of good public policy. And the new education policy also talks of the interdisciplinary nature of learning. And it's one of the tragedies of Indian education system. I use the strong word tragedy because it is a tragedy to my mind, that our educational approach has been very, very unidirectional. So you hardly had any option or opportunity for a student studying medicine to study literature or psychology or sociology, and same applied to all disciplines. I did my engineering way back. I graduated in '97, and we had just one course in literature, and I think a 3-credit course in management. That's it. In a 4-year, 8-semester curriculum, we had just 2 subjects outside the engineering discipline, which to my mind is a very narrow way of learning, a very narrow approach towards studying engineering. This has implications in the professional world, most notably in the world of public policy, because if our policy makers do not take a holistic view, are not trained in a comprehensive and holistic manner, then that reflects in the work culture, that reflects in the policy that's being made, and that gets reflected in the outcomes of those policies. So I really hope and urge that SGPA will adopt a very, very strong interdisciplinary approach, uh, uh, and draw from the expertise and the competence of the larger university which Xavier is known for. Now let me come to the topic for today, public policy in India, challenges and choices. Now it's a very, very vast topic. I'll try my best to narrow it down to some essential elements of the challenges and some essential elements of the choices, and then what direction the policy landscape is taking in India, and what my
Yeah, I think again his line went off. Can you all hear me?
Yes, Father, we can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah. So you can throw some more light. Yeah.
Is he coming?
Yes, Father, we can hear you.
Okay. So let me also parallelly continue because we have to have a standby for this kind of technical glitches. Okay. Now, what he was talking about his own engineering experiences. So the courses that we have, the subjects, the disciplines that we have, it's all restricted, only to a particular domain knowledge. Engineering, civil engineering, only civil concept, that domain only. So our education, the knowledge is not very broad based. You don't have anything on political science, you don't have anything on public policy, you don't have anything on leadership, pure engineering. See, that is how our entire thing is focused. Now the new education policy also will talk about the choice-based credit system in the UG level as well as in the PG level. Suppose you are all doing public policy. You want to take 1 or 2 courses in communication, let us say. The choice should be given. Choice should be given. You are studying rural management. You want to do something on, say, sustainability, or something on urban management, or something on public policy. Proportionate or equivalent credits should be taken from one school to the other school. That is the level of education in abroad. I think the new education policy is going to focus on that as of now. Choice-based credit system. Choice-based credit system. So if that is implemented, I think once again, this governance, public policy will play a major role into this.
Father, I think he has come again. Let us
Again?
see. Yeah. Just now I got a phone call. Let me see. No, not yet. Not yet. Not yet, Father. Not yet.
Not yet. I am not seeing him.
Yeah. Continue, Father. Yeah.
Yeah. So keeping that one, first, when you start this program, I would request all the participants ask a question.
Yeah. Yes, come. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, sir.
Sir, please go ahead. Yeah.
Sincere apologies for this technical glitch. I'm so sorry. So sorry, Father.
Yeah, no problem.
So I was talking about the topic for today, the choices and the challenges. So I'll speak for about 20-25 minutes on the various challenges and the choices, some of the various challenges and choices, and then briefly outline the direction which public policy is taking in India, in my view, and then leave it up for Q&A. Hope that's okay.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, sir. Please.
Okay. Right. I personally strongly believe that amongst all the options, public policy is the best tool. For effecting sustainable social changes. And I'll give some of the reasons why I feel so. Why I think that the policy environment is the root cause for either good or bad socio-economic indicators and parameters, not necessarily in India but across the globe. Now let's go back to the two fundamental questions inherent in today's topic. What is public policy, and who makes public policy, or who makes policy, and who are the beneficiaries or not. And I emphasize on the words "or not" of those policies. Now, all of us, basic civics taught in school tells us about the three branches of government: the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, and the separation of power between the three branches. That's also enshrined in our constitution, and in fact, Kesavananda Bharati judgment of the Supreme Court of 1973 has argued that it's the basic structure of the Constitution, the separation of power between the three branches, which means that it cannot be amended or it cannot be altered. So that is the importance of the three branches independently. Now, oftentimes we hear about the term judicial activism. Now, what is judicial activism? Judicial activism is when the judiciary and largely the constitutional judiciary, that which means the Supreme Court of India and the state high court and the high courts in various states. We largely hear about how the constitutional courts are encroaching into the turf of executive decision making or executive policy making, legislative policy making. Now, why is so? Critics might say it's judicial activism, critics might say it is encroachment, it is a violation of the basic structure. But if I were to take a benign view, if I were to take a lenient view of the court's approach, it is because the executive and the legislative branches have ceded that space, have created that vacuum where the judiciary felt the need to step in, where you have the legislative branch of the government not fulfilling its legislative mandate, and you have the executive branch of the government not fulfilling its executive decision making or implementation aspect, then no doubt the constitutional courts they have to step in. And I would like to here quote none other than the Attorney General, the current Attorney General, Mr. Venugopal, who is one of the doyens of the Indian bar. He's about 90 years old, and I was on a webinar in May of this year where he spoke about judicial activism, and let me quote. And he said, through judicial activism, the Supreme Court has done a tremendous amount of good. It has practically tried to wipe away every tears of the underprivileged, disadvantaged, and illiterate sections of society. Now, mark the words. It has tried to wipe away every tears of the underprivileged, disadvantaged, and illiterate sections of the society. Does it not sound like an election manifesto? Does it not sound like this quote or this speech could have been made by any politician or any policymaker or any minister? But this comes from the Attorney General of India speaking, on or rather speaking on flattering terms on what is called judicial activism. Okay. Now I'll take the liberty to cite a couple of examples to emphasize why and how the Supreme Court of India has acted more like a policymaker than as an interpreter of the policy or of the law. Many of us might have heard of the Visakha guidelines on sexual harassment. Okay, now this direction or guideline from the Supreme Court led the Indian Parliament to enact the Prevention of Sexual Harassment Act. Okay, again, now had the Visakha guideline not been initiated by the Supreme Court, would the Sexual Harassment Act been enacted by the Parliament? Now I do not know. None of us know, because we can't go back into history. But the fact that the Supreme Court had to nudge the legislature to enact a policy by itself, enacting a policy guideline, tells us that policy making is not restricted, at least in India, to just the two other branches or rather the legislative branch which is mandated to make policy. Now, let me give another example of the Supreme Court decreeing that every public transport in Delhi should run on CNG. As all of us know, Delhi is one of the most polluted cities in the world, and the situation was far more worse prior to a couple of years ago, maybe a decade or so ago, when public transports in Delhi didn't use CNG. And this forced the Supreme Court of India to make it mandatory for all public transports in Delhi to use CNG. Again, something which the legislature should have enacted through legislation, or the executive should have enacted through its executive discussion. Now, public interest litigation, PIL jurisdiction, which is one of the most benign aspect of policy making by judiciary, pioneered by Justice Bhagwati and Justice Krishna Iyer in the 70s and the 80s. This literally transformed the arena of public policy making. Countless judgments are attributed to these two formidable judges, the late judges, who through this PIL jurisdiction enlarged and encompassed policy making into virtually every sphere, whether it's health or education or law and order or infrastructure. Not a single arena of policy or public policy was left untouched by this PIL jurisdiction. They also enlarged the scope of Article 21 of the Constitution, which guarantees life and liberty to every Indian citizen. As Article 21 reads, no Indian citizen shall be deprived of his life or liberty except by procedure enacted by law. Now, a simple reading of Article 21 will tell us that the court, the state cannot take away anyone's life or imprison someone without following the due process of law. Now, Justice Bhagwati and Justice Krishna Iyer and other judges as well, but predominantly these are the two justices who propounded this. They enlarged the scope of Article 21 to mean that even clean drinking water, clean air, the liberty and the freedom to practice one's culture, all of it, the right to one's sexual choices, right to privacy, in the Aadhaar judgment of 2018. So all of this can come under right to life. If there is no privacy, what is the point of liberty and life? If you do not have your sexual choice, then what is the point of being a human being? So these are some of the remarkable and stellar interpretations of right to life of Article 21, which led to affirmative policy making in India. Now, I'm not personally in favor of judicial activism, because I feel that it is serious encroachment into policy making by a branch of government which should restrict itself to interpret law or to interpret policy making. Now, leaving aside the basic structure of the Constitution, or leaving aside the separation of power very, very clearly enshrined in our Constitution, I think it's leaving a very dangerous precedent in policy making in this country. My humble view is that it is a serious erosion of executive authority. If the citizens feel that the government of the day is not helping them, or if the executive branch is not doing its duty, and for every redressal or for every recourse they have to run to the court or the judiciary for conducive policies and for implementation of those policies, then I think this is leading to very, very dangerous precedents. Okay, so this is one of the key challenge to policy making in India, in my view. The other challenge which answers the second query is public policy making for whom? Who are the intended beneficiaries or not of policy making? Now, it has become so fashionable, and I think all of us would have discussed this umpteen number of times as to how policy making is divorced from the grassroots realities. The implementation of the policies that are made in Bhubaneswar or in the state capitals or in Delhi. Now, I perceive this as a disconnect between the goals which the political leadership or the political class wants to hand out, assuming that we are a welfare state, and the systemic changes which are expected from the government of the day, which are going to bring sustainable and long-lasting changes. Now, let me give you an example. The Ayushman Bharat Yojana, which is, I think, one of the best public policy programs of the Modi government in 2014-19 and the first Modi government. Now, it is world's largest health insurance program intended to benefit hundreds of millions of citizens. Very well thought of, very, I think, comprehensive policy. But now look at the disconnect. We have one of the most inadequate, most pathetic, primary health infrastructure in the world. We have countries such as Japan and Korea spending almost 15% of their GDP, gross GDP on health. And what are we spending on? Less than 4%. So when you have a health system or a health infrastructure, primary I'm talking about, we have very, very good tertiary health infrastructure. And this is why India is becoming a destination for health. I'm not getting into that. But bulk of the cities, more than 80% of the citizens are dependent on the primary and the secondary health infrastructure. They do not, most of the citizens of this country do not go to an Amri or an Apollo. They go to the district headquarters hospital or the block hospital, what we call CHC, or even to the primary health centers at the GP and the village level. Now, where are the doctors? Where are the trained paramedics? Where are the devices? Where are the, the requisite medicines at these PHCs and CHCs? So even if we design a world-class policy, health policy, and an insurance program to benefit the citizens, the lack of grassroots realities seriously impedes the implementation of this policy. So, to give another example, the RTI, Right to Information Act, which became a law in 2005, I'm sorry. And again, to my mind, is one of the foremost sound policies made in the last 20 years, which has empowered millions of citizens to seek answers from the powers to be, to check corruption, to bring transparency in governance. Now, one of the pioneers, one of the key architects of RTI was Mrs. Aruna Roy, okay, who has an organization, who runs an organization called MKSS based out of Rajasthan. Now, Aruna Roy, who herself was a former civil servant and then quit the service to start MKSS and get into development sector, used to expose corruption in the NREGA, the Mahatma Gandhi, subsequently NREGA, and previous to that, there was this work for food program. And local contractors in cohort with the local officials used to indulge in massive corruption, and it was an open secret. Almost everyone knew that the work for food program or the NREGA program has inherent limitations and inherent deficiencies, which leads to a lot of corruption in the system. The primary corruption being, the false muster rule. So, I'm not getting the details of the program, but you have a muster roll where the name of every laborer who works gets listed, and he or she gets paid the minimum daily wage. Now, if you go to any, now I think it's less prevalent, but I'm talking of the early 2000s and mid, the early years of 2005-4. Any public infrastructure site where NREGA was implemented, mostly the contractors used machineries and cranes, whereas it's strictly prohibited. It's strictly a program where the unemployed, men and women, unemployed and willing men and women, were to get 100 days of work, okay, to enable them to, earn livelihood. Now, contractors, by using machinery, completed the work and created false muster rolls, depriving large section of poor people of their daily wage. Now, this is what Mrs. Roy, Ms. Aruna Roy was trying to check. But she realized that, she could only do so much. She could possibly, do a Jan Tsunami, which was her mode of operation in a few villages, in a few panchayats, which she did. But then what? So this led her to start working on creating the architect for the Right to Information Act. And through this, she has enabled millions of citizens, across the country in making their public representatives and making their government accountable, which any public policy, should, right? So that is the second challenge of policy making in India: the disconnect between uh, the state capitals and the grassroots where the policy gets implemented, or if you wish, the disconnect between the direct action mode and the systemic changes. Uh, Now, if I were to juxtapose RTI versus Garibi Hatao, so RTI is a systemic change. Garibi Hatao is a slogan which just talked of giving some handouts, some goals, to some citizens, and it might have worked somewhere at some point of time, but it never, ever led to reduction in poverty or sustainable development of India. Right? So that is the second biggest challenge. Uh, People often ask me, where does Odisha lie in this spectrum? You have the direct action at one end of the spectrum, which is like giving handouts, giving loans as part of a welfare state. And on the other hand, you have, the market economy, uh, and somewhere in between lies, the effort of the state to bring about systematic changes. And I think Odisha is I do not want to get political here, because I am part of the ruling dispensation and the ruling party of Odisha, so some might perceive my views to be a bit biased, but I think the facts speak for themselves. The 20 years since 2000 that Sri Naveen Patnaik has been the Chief Minister of Odisha speak for itself. In the pre-2000 era, Odisha was probably at the bottom, or along with Bihar, the second most bottom state in almost all the socio-economic indicators and parameters. I come from a district called Kalahandi, Odisha, and it used to take us 16 hours, close to 15-16 hours to travel to Bhubaneswar from Kalahandi. Today, I'm able to reach Kalahandi from Bhubaneswar straight 7.5 hours. I have traveled to the most remotest of places in Odisha during the elections, and I can vouch that the transport, the infrastructure, the road infrastructure, the power infrastructure in Odisha is probably second to none in the country. Disaster management, again, one huge area of policy making. Odisha is an exemplary state. Odisha has now global acclaim in the area of disaster management. I can go on and on and on. But the point I wish to make is somewhere there is a fine balance between policy making, at the level of the chief minister or the ministers or the secretaries, and the effectiveness and implementation of those policies at the grassroots, at the panchayat level, the GP level. And in Odisha, obviously, a lot more needs to be done. I'm the first person to admit and to say, and I have said it, and in fact, I've written about it as well, that government of Odisha has probably not done a very good job of improving its health infrastructure. I think much more could be done. Thankfully, now we are coming up with many new medical colleges. Government is setting up more and more PHCs. The funding to the health sector has gone up many-fold in the last couple of years. So obviously, not everything is hunky-dory, but by and large, I think that fine balance between the policy made here in Bhubaneswar and the implement of those policies at the districts and the blocks and the panchayat, that fine balance has somehow been better in Odisha in the last 20 years, right? Now, the third challenge of policy making is the lack of trust. Between the citizens and its policymakers. Now, there's a fine book called The Gated Republic, by Sankar Iyer, and I urge everyone to read the book, and I think it's also available online. You can download it as a PDF free of cost. This talks about this trust deficit. You know, we see more and more citizens now, seceding, or rather, depending on the plug and play economy or on the private sector for meeting their basic needs, whether it's water, whether it's power, school, education, uh, and also, for the security and safety. Now, why would a concerned citizenry opt for private players and pay for those services if you have an elected government, a democratically elected government, which is mandated to provide these services? That is largely because this is the harsh reality, and that is largely because of the failure of the state in making these public services reach its citizens, right? But this is a vicious cycle. It's a vicious cycle, and this cycle can only be broken if there are systemic changes, which I have spoken about. Right. Otherwise, we'll have a small minority which is willing and able to pay for these services, and a vast majority of citizens who are unable to pay for these services or are unwilling to pay for these services. But that trust deficit will continue to get amplified, leading to disharmony and eventually to social unrest. So this
sir,
is a
excuse
challenge.
me. Can you close it in another 3 minutes, and we'll have more time for the question answers. We have a lot of questions. Yeah, thank you, sir.
Sure. And the last challenge which I would like to highlight is the the disconnect between the authority and accountability. Now, I think 2G scam was a game changer when Mr. Raja was arrested. Okay, for alleged, I think he has not yet been finally acquitted by the Supreme Court. So let's call it alleged. So for alleged irregularities in the allocation of spectrum, and then we had Suresh Kalmadi, who was arrested for a while for the Commonwealth scams. So those were the events which were game changers in the history of independent India. Prior to that, we never heard of people in power or people in authority being accountable for their actions. Okay. There are examples of political parties or governments squandering public exchequer or public resources, and then the next incumbent government has to face the music in terms of fiscal deficit and in terms of not having enough resources to carry out the welfare programs. So that divorce between the authority and the accountability is another serious challenge, and this is also because of lack of accountability, the last mile delivery of public services is not accounted for. And any development expert will tell you that last mile of delivery is the first mile of good governance. We can make endless number of policies, but unless the last mile or the last citizen sitting in a remote hamlet in Thomalampu block in Kalahandi is beneficiary of that policy, then I think it's of no use, right? So you take off Sweden, you take off any OECD country, and every country which has been on that development trajectory has done it because they have decentralized governance, which unfortunately in India has yet to see the light of the day. We have the 73rd and 74th Amendment of the Constitution, which came out in 1993, 94, and which was meant to devolve power to the grassroots, to the panchayats and to the urban local bodies. But all of us know that real devolution of power hasn't happened yet. Finances is still with the state secretary or with the departments, and the elected sarpanches or the elected chairpersons or mayors have to run from pillar to post to seek their budget approvals and get finances from the government. So these are the challenges. I'll restrict myself here, and over the course of the Q&A, I'll answer a bit more. But let me conclude by saying that I think there was never a better time to study public policy in India. I really compliment HUB for this wonderful program, and I hope that the students will greatly value this program, and they have made a very, very good, let me assure you, all the students, that you have made a very sound and good career choice. I congratulate you all to be the charter badge of SGPA. And let me just say a couple of career choices. Obviously, due to paucity of time, we can't get into the details, but I'm happy to do it some other time. I'm myself a beneficiary of being a lateral entrant into government. And Prime Minister Modi has often spoken about bringing lateral talent into policy making. And he has already initiated many joint level appointments in Delhi. There's a lot of resistance as of now, but I'm sure, this process will only accelerate. Many state governments have started what they call the policy fellows or the good governance fellows. In fact, we were also seriously thinking of starting something in Odisha called Chief Minister's Good Governance Fellows. Maharashtra has one, Chhattisgarh has one, Haryana has a very, very robust program. And Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, the former Prime Minister, has started something called the Prime Minister's Research Development Fellows, wherein they brought young policy experts and policy wonks like you all, and made them work with the government, with the district administration in giving up developmental changes. The corporate sector. You name any large corporation today, whether it's Google, Facebook, Reliance, Infosys, you name it. Every corporation today has a robust policy team. Why? Because that interaction between civil society, between the government, and between business has increased manifold. That gap has blurred, and they do need policy experts to help them understand the nuances of policies and understand better understand and appreciate policy making. Niti Aayog has been hiring scores of policy students and policy graduates. So I think there's huge humongous opportunities for all of you. And let me just reiterate that there is a huge requirement for professionally trained policy experts, and I'm sure you have made the best career choice, and wish you all the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Before I request the audience to ask questions, I would like to take a couple of minutes to summarize what you have spoken so far. I think you have talked about 4 challenges. Number 1, the rise of judicial activism. I think, is it a threat or is it a hope? I think that's a question that you are left with. And also in that context, you talked about, the trinity of democracy or the 3 pillars of democracy. Therefore, the kind of disconnect, that's the second challenge you talked about, what one does, the other tries to undo, or, there is no complementarity between the 3. That is the second challenge you talked about. And the third challenge that you spoke of, the lack of trust that we are witnessing in the country today. And finally, you also talk about the balancing between the authority and the accountability. I think what was more inspiring was on each challenge you gave ample examples and evidences to make us understand. After listening to you, one gets a feeling, the importance of public policy not only in India but the globe as well. And that the kind of the time that we are in, I think the need for public policy has assumed much more significance and importance. I think that's exactly you try to highlight and tell all of us. So with these few words of summary, I would like to open the floor for questions. You can post your questions on the chat box, or you raise your hand, whichever way, or you just tell your name and you can start asking. Okay, over to you, my dear friends. Who would like to come first? I think there is somebody, Anil Kumar Sharma. He has a question, sir. People by their choice come to join civil services and assured to do best for the welfare of common people. But many times they couldn't deliver as government sets its goals. Why such practices take place? The dichotomy between the government and the civil servants, the conflict between the government and the civil servants. There's a question from Mr. Anil Kumar. Sir, would you like to answer this?
Sure, I think as Mr. Anil has rightly pointed out, almost every civil servant joins the government with a lot of hope, lot of dreams, and a vision of making a difference in the lives of people. But see, we have to accept that policy making in a country like Singapore which is a city nation, or a small nation like Sweden, or a homogeneous society like Sweden or Belgium, is far more easier than policy making in a very complex and huge and diverse country like India, right? So when civil servants they are become part of the government, they have to work in this very complex and diverse environment where you have the political bosses and their priorities. Then you have the community, which has a separate set of challenges, and then you have the judiciary, and you have the boundaries of law, right? So even with the best of intentions, oftentimes they are unable to implement, the ideas and the plans they have, because of political compulsions, because of the contextual requirement. If a young officer is posted to a district as a collector or as a district magistrate, the local nuances may not allow, or the local context may not allow the collector to work on certain ideas and innovations which he would like to. But I think that's okay. I think that's work in progress. Policy making is not a day's job. I think the civil servants have a long career, 30-35 years career, and over the 30-35 years they do work in many different roles and positions. And the well-meaning and committed civil servants are able to make a difference. They may not make a difference in one or two roles or in one or two postings, but it is empirically proven that good officers, they do tend to shine in their career in different roles. So I think there's nothing to be disheartened here. It's a learning, it's a work in progress. We are in a democratic system. We are not an authoritarian regime like China, where any civil servant or any CCP member can just dictate anything, and that becomes the law. So we have to work within the boundaries of the constitution and the legal process, and the compulsions of our society and the nature of the Indian democracy.
Yeah, thank you. I think I would like to give reference to these questions raised by the students. Then I will come to the faculty. So my faculty colleagues, kindly bear with me. Let us give chances to the students first. There is a question from Meenakshi. She is our RM student. She is saying, do you think coronavirus or COVID-19 will lead to a new age of environmental behaviors? So this is the question to you, sir.
I don't think so. I think this is we are forced to now cut down on our environmental behavior or on our daily behavior because of COVID-19. But by human nature, we so the human nature is such that we tend to travel, we tend to explore, we tend to splurge, and I think this temporary behavior will correct once correct for the worse. I'm afraid once the situation improves and the lockdown, the shutdown is lifted. So if anything, I foresee a much rather greater assault on the environment than I think the subdued environmental degrading behavior.
Thank you, sir. I think there is a question from Professor Nirali Shah. She's asking, can you please throw light on public policy making up and or top-down approach?
I'm sorry, Professor. Sorry, what's?
Yeah, the question is, can you tell us the difference between public policy making as a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach?
I think I have already slightly hinted at that. Public policy has to be a marriage between the top-down and the bottom-up approach. Unfortunately, for a very, very long while, we made policies from Delhi and from the state capitals without understanding the local context or without involving the community. And the result is for everyone to see. The infamous statement by Mr. Rajiv Gandhi that every rupee sent by Delhi, only 12 paisa reaches the intended beneficiary. That tells us all. So the 73rd and the 74th Amendment of the Constitution was supposed to correct this anomaly. Unfortunately, it has worked. It has worked in the sense that it has given political power to a large section of people. Most notably, it has given political legitimacy to a vast number of women, because almost every state has 50% reservation in the three-tier Panchayati Raj system for women. But real devolution can happen only when the financial devolution happens. Unfortunately, even today, the panchayats and the urban bodies have no financial power of their own. They have very, very restricted financial power. But by and large, they are dependent on the state government and the state the departments for their financial needs. So the planning process, we have done away with the 5-year planning, and now we have the VDPs, the village development planning plans, and the GPDPs, the GP development plans. So that's a bottom-up approach towards policy making. So I think it will take some time, but government is cognizant of this. All the state governments and the government of India is cognizant of this fact that they cannot just dictate policies from the top, and it has to be a synergy and harmony between the bottom up and the top down approach. So
yeah, so there is another question from a student. There are students of our public policy program, 2 of them. The first one is from Ms. Yukti Jain. She is asking a very interesting, probably a personal question to you. She's asking, I am curious about what a typical day for you looks like as a policymaker. Probably she is already putting herself in your shoes.
See, I mean, you did, Professor Pepin, you did mention that I'm an academic. So I honestly enjoy my role as an academic or as a lawyer far more than I do as a politician.
Happy to hear that.
So now the role has changed a great deal because I'm no longer part of the government. But for the last 4 years, from 16 until March of this year, I was with the government as a policy planner and as a policy maker. So my role was to bridge the gap between the policy and the people and the community. The question which was asked by asked previously. So, and because mine was a political appointment, I was also an interface between the party, the Biju Janata Dal, and the government of Odisha. So on a typical day, I would, make sure that the policies of the state are based on, empirical analysis or based on empirical evidence. I would test the effectiveness of policies through the lens of empirical science. Which was largely neglected before. I wouldn't say it was not happening, but previously policy in Odisha at least was largely anecdote based. It was largely based on the the whims and fancies of the concerned persons or the need of the hour, or it was based on conventional wisdom. But I think we were able to bring some element of scientific analysis, some element of empirical science into policy making. With the help of data, and let me tell you that the government has the best data. Contrary to what people believe, that government doesn't have much data. Government of India and the state governments are sitting on piles and piles of good data. That is one of the best things about our census and about our data collection mechanism. The problem is each department sits on its own set of data. So there is no handshake really between various departments in terms of data sharing. So what we try to do, and thankfully, unfortunately, Government of India is also doing that. We try to bring every single scheme of Government of Odisha into a single platform, and every single beneficiary could be identified by a single identifier. So if you ask me about a particular family in Malkangiri district, residing in some remote hamlet, let's say, and what are the schemes that family has received from Government of Odisha or from Government of India, in a matter of few seconds, I should be able to tell you that and give you that information. So that is the ultimate objective of our policy making process. And that was largely my role, and unfortunately I had to resign from my role to become member of parliament. So it doesn't directly answer Yukti's question, but there is no standard typical day, but it depends on the kind of political work I have to do. It depends on the policy work that I have to do. Then I have my legal practice, and then of course now I'm getting into some parliamentary work as well.
So the point is you are expected to devote some time for SGP, XUB from today onwards. That is what our students are expecting from you. Okay, thank you. So the next question is.
That one,
yes, Father.
Kippy,
yes, Father.
Yeah, he has agreed to teach in SGP also. Okay.
Oh, yes, Father.
So in public policy also, a couple of courses he will be teaching.
Yes, Father.
And also in the School of Law, he is already visiting faculty there, School of Law.
Yeah.
So he will be closely associating with the university.
Thank you, Father. Yes, we are more than I'm glad to know that.
You can ask more questions to him when he comes.
Yeah. So the next question is, let me give the chance to two of my students from rural management. I think this is from Ashikta. So the question is regarding it's a long question. I have a question regarding the 1973 case to which you referred in the first challenge. Indira Gandhi and other politicians back then spoke about the need to maintain the sanctity of the constitution and the ambiguity of not being able to find out what is the basic framework of it. Therefore, how can this ambiguity be solved? I hope you got the question, sir.
Yeah. I think it's more or less settled now. The fact that India is a secular country, the fact that we have separation of power, the fact that we are a federal structure, the fact that fundamental rights, democratic form of government, these are all part of the basic structure. And I think the Kesavananda Bharati judgment has more or less settled this. Yes, I think time and again we hear of new aspects, whether they come under the basic structure or not. But see, when the Supreme Court gave the Kesavananda judgment, they couldn't have anticipated all possible scenarios, right? Now it's 47 years old now, that judgment. And we are still talking of what constitutes basic structure and what not. So obviously, the judges were also human beings, so they couldn't have anticipated what will fall under the basic structure or not. But the broad framework has been laid out. And when and if there is any confusion or any dichotomy, then it's for the court to settle it. Some people claim that right to privacy should be part of the basic structure, and Supreme Court said yes, because they read right to privacy as part of Article 21. Okay, there was serious opposition to this, saying how can right to privacy be part of the basic structure? But the Supreme Court said right to privacy is right to life, and being right to life being a fundamental right is part of the basic structure. and hence, by default, right to privacy is part of the basic structure. So, you know, I think this will be an endless, you know, a struggle. And based on the need and the context, I think the Supreme Court is very, very competent to settle this as and when it arises.
Yeah, sir, we will have three more questions. One again, two from the students and one from the faculty. Sorry, four more questions and one from a friend from outside our university. This question is from Hemant Kumar. He is also a rural management student. He has got two questions, but I would like to read only one because of paucity of time. How can the decentralization of states through different capitals help a densely populated and a huge state like Uttar Pradesh? He's asking about how can a decentralization of states can be helped with the help of different capitals.
So I'm not sure what's his query, but if I understand him correctly, whether UP should be truncated into more states or whether there should be more than one capital. Let me quickly answer both of these. I think that was his query, and please correct if it's not the case.
I think he meant
yes.
that, you know, can there be, you know, different capitals, more than one capital for a big state like you?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. See, UP, my personal view, and this is not Biju Janata Dal's view, and I'm here speaking for myself. I strongly believe that UP should be, you know, broken down into 2-3 more states, like Uttarakhand was. You know, if you look at the performance of Chhattisgarh or Uttarakhand or Jharkhand vis-a-vis when they were part of the, you know, the larger states, respectively, I think the case is very clear that smaller states bring better governance. Okay, so maybe Bundelkhand could be one state, Purvanchal could be another state in UP. But again, this is a very, very political thing, so I don't want to get into that. Coming to more than one capital, see, the current Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh is trying to do that with not very good consequences. You know, you can have regional councils. You can have regional councils in different parts of the state, or you can have multiple. One capital is going to lead to confusion. Administrative, it might lead to administrative anarchy, and something similar is happening in Andhra Pradesh. So I'm not sure if UP should have more than one capital. Yes, agree that, you know, someone residing in eastern UP has to travel 600 or 700 kilometers to go to Lucknow for his work. But that is precisely why I think there is a greater case and need for smaller states. Okay. But I think every state should have just one capital, and then maybe they can have more than one development councils, and each council could be a different part of the state.
I think that's a very good answer. Thank you, sir. And the last question from the student side is, our public policy student is asking how industrial policy is going to be affected during the climate change crisis. In other words, will the terms of EIA, which is, you know, in news nowadays, will get affected to sustain economic growth?
Will they? How is industrial policy going to affect climate change? Is that?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, in the context of EIA, environmental impact assessment. You know that.
Yeah. See, I do not know much about EIA, but I think business. See, we are talking about double bottom line. We are talking about triple bottom line now. We are talking of environmental scorecards. But ultimately, you know, there has to be a business case for businesses or for industry to be environment friendly. Milton Friedman said the business of business is business. So unless you make being environmentally friendly remunerative to your revenues or being good for your business, I think industry or business will not change. You can give incentives, but incentives can only take you that far. Ultimately, it's for the consumers. Ultimately, it's for the the bottom line to dictate the business behavior in terms of environment or in terms of being socially friendly. So I have always been, a votary of free market, not in the sense of giving a free hand to business or enterprise, but in the sense that let the market decide and let the market recalibrate or correct any imbalance in the environment or in the social landscape. That's again a personal take.
So the last two questions, the first one is from Shakti from BSSUT. He is asking about, how do students get engaged in the public policy and governance related matters?
Very good question. I think the best way is to take up intensives. In fact, there is something called LAMPS Fellowship by PRS. I can send. I ask my office to send the details to you, Professor.
Yeah, please do, sir. Yeah.
And then you can share it. So now members of parliament and some states also have the MLAs work with interns, policy interns. So that's, I think, a great way of learning policy making, witnessing firsthand, shadowing the MP or the MLA or the minister, and observing what a typical day of the minister or the MP looks like, and learning the nuances of policy making. So that is one way. Second is you can intern with think tanks. You have CCS, you have Center for Policy Research, you have a lot of think tanks who are hiring interns and hiring volunteers. Personally, I would be happy to have a few interns attached to my office.
You.
So.
Okay, and the last question is from one of my colleagues, Professor Sandap Sanari Mishra, who has joined our school. Now he is asking, coalition politics is a bigger challenge in India, where most regional parties are always pulling the center. So what is your view on that?
Well, it is true. It is true that governance gets hampered with multiple pools and pressures of regional parties and of the coalition partners. But having said that, Mr. Vajpayee, led the NDA from 1999 to 2004 with, I think, some 20 odd parties, and his was it was a very progressive government in my view. So true. I mean, you have Deve Gowda's government, and then Aki Gujral's, and then Mr. Narasimha Rao's government, which were coalition, which was an amalgamation of coalition, which were multiple coalition partners coming together, and there were a lot of challenges, governance challenges, and decision making gets delayed. You have pulls and pressures. So yes, I think ideally there should be a single party or a single configuration, but unfortunately we do not have a bi-party system. So we have a multi-party system, and thankfully from 2014 onwards we have a single party dominating. Thankfully or not, it's an opinion, but at least in terms of decision making, it is faster. But there are a lot of disadvantages of a single party dominating, single configuration dominating the political landscape. So coalition definitely has its disadvantages, but also sometimes it leads to the required balances, checks and balances. So and as a regional party member, I will always advocate for more power to the states, and I will always advocate for more federalism, which unfortunately has become a casualty in the current dispensation.
Thank you, sir. So there are a lot more questions, but unfortunately we don't have time, and we also don't want to hold you back. So now I would like to thank all of you. To begin with, I would like to thank our Vice Chancellor, who has been, as I said earlier, actively engaged in ensuring that this school takes off by launching the Masters in Public Policy and Governance. As I told you earlier, he has taken enormous amount of efforts, even to the extent of involving the entire university administration in the admission process and the faculty recruitment process, all the process that we need to go through in order to set up a school. Father has been extremely helpful and very supportive, and I must very honestly confess it is entirely due to his effort that we are able to see the launch of this program today. I also would like to mention two of our friends and well-wishers, Honorable Dr. Amar Patnaik, who is also your colleague, who has been instrumental in planting the idea with our university, with our previous Vice Chancellor. And he has been, helping us in many ways. And I also take this opportunity to thank him on behalf of our university and on behalf of our the SDBA school. I also would like to mention Professor Shobana Rana, who was my predecessor, who was the dean, and she had done some of the groundwork along with my colleague Professor Simanta Mohandi. So I would like to thank both of them in a particular way on this commencement day for their efforts and all the good work they have done. I would like to thank all my fellow deans and my colleagues, and above all my students for taking time to attend this important lecture by you. I also would like to thank our registrar, Father Augustine, our deputy registrars, Father Tony and Father Arakyadas, and also the IT team who has been working tirelessly to make sure we don't have any technical glitches, unlike few things that you faced. We didn't face that.
My
Thanks
apologies.
to our technical IT team. And I also would like to thank Mr. Sunil Kumar. I must say, you have got an excellent hand, I tell you. He is really smart, I must say, though I have not met him, but whatever little interaction I had with him, he is very smart. I also would like to thank my colleague, Ms. Pramila, who has been helping us in designing the poster and coordinating with other departments. And of course, my another colleague, Sasmita Mohandi, she is our secretarial staff. She is also interacting with all the students, faculty, and the entire administrative team to make this event a great success. Also, I would like to thank our friends in the both Vice Chancellor's office, Ms. Juvi, and also Mr. Barik. Then also Ms. Sarala in for the Registrar's office for their constant support. Sir, finally, it is our duty to thank from the bottom of our heart for taking your precious time to be with us and deliver the commencement lecture for this important and the historic event of launching Masters in Public Policy and Governance. Sir, you are part of the history making, and we look forward to your continued support and guidance in the years to come. With these few words, I would like to thank all of you once again for your patience and presence. Thank you very much.